Raising awareness of wildlife trafficking, the UN says it's a crime threatening many plant and animal species. And nearly every country in the world contributes to the problem. So how big is the illegal wildlife trade and who is gaining from it? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Laura Kyle. Crimes involving wildlife have increased dramatically over the last few years. The World Wildlife Fund says they account for the fifth most profitable illicit trade in the world. A trade that's estimated to be worth $10 billion a year. Now, for the first time, the UN has produced a global report on the problem. It says virtually every country in the world plays a role either as a source, transit or destination for illegal wildlife. And it says suspected traffickers represent some 80 different nationalities. Elephant ivory, reptile skins, pangolin, parrots and caviar top the list of seized animal products with the highest value. But despite crackdowns on the sale of certain products, or perhaps because of them, laundering is a growing problem. The report says illegally acquired wildlife is being sold in legal markets. Much of the time, the buyer is unaware. And it says without international regulation, it's difficult to prevent illegally acquired wildlife from being traded once the goods leave their home harbour. So let's bring in our guest today in Vienna via Skype. We have Ted Leggett. He's a senior research officer on crime and criminal justice at the UNODC. He's also the main researcher for this report. In Brussels, we have Debbie Banks. She's a lead campaigner for tigers and wildlife crime at the Environmental Investigation Agency. And in Nairobi, we have Ofir Drori, a founding director of the advocacy and law enforcement group called Eagle. Thank you all very much for being here today. Ted, if I could start with you, can you give us a bit of a global overview on just how serious the situation is?
We collected a database of over 164,000 seizures. We found that over 7,000 wildlife species are involved in one way or another in the trafficking that's taking place. We didn't try to quantify the scale of the problem because it's simply so complex. There's so many species involved that to do a proper assessment would be a major undertaking. So what we did instead was focus on 8 of the most prominent species in trade, and we did in-depth case studies of those.
How does it compare? How does the illegal trade in wildlife compare to other illegal trades when you're talking about things like drugs and weapons and human trafficking?
Well, again, we didn't try to quantify it in those terms because simply too complex. But we did look at some of the modalities that are involved in this type of trafficking. They're indeed similar to other types of trafficking, particularly of commodities where any given product can be either legal or illegal depending on how and where it was sourced. For example, firearms or pharmaceuticals or even cultural property are examples of items that with the proper paperwork, the exact same item could be legal or illegal. Wildlife is the same, and this is a point of vulnerability for wildlife trafficking because with the forged, fraudulently acquired, or paperwork that's acquired through corruption, it is possible to traffic wildlife products with impunity.
And are we talking about sort of the same levels, the same networks of organised crime?
Usually, most of the wildlife commodities we examined are not being trafficked by mafia-type organizations. Rather, it's sort of gray business oftentimes, that people who are involved may or may not be aware that they're involved in an illicit market. Oftentimes they are with a bit of a wink and a nod. They know that they can't trace the origins of the wildlife that they're sourcing and that those products may indeed be illegal, but they find their way into mainstream commerce. And we all participate in creating demand for a lot of these products.
Yeah, that's certainly an issue I want to return to just a little later in the discussion. First of all, Debbie and Ofir, I know that you are both working on the front lines of this criminal world. It'd be very interesting to hear some of your experiences. Debbie, you've spent years infiltrating criminal gangs in China and Nepal. I mean, this gives you such a unique perspective on this trade. Do you agree with the way that Ted describes them?
I think well, we've been looking at the international illegal trade in the parts and products of tigers. and other Asian big cats between India, Nepal and China. We've been looking at the consumer end, so in China, often doing undercover investigations to engage with the criminals who are offering tiger and leopard skin and bone, teeth, claws, etc. And trying to find out the who, the what, the where, the why and the when of how these criminal networks operate. And they are indeed organised. There are organised and systematic poaching networks operating between India and Nepal. They're in contact with middlemen and buyers who are moving the products into China, and there's quite a closed network of traders on the other side of the border in China moving those tiger skins on to markets like Lhasa and Shigatse, where tiger and leopard skins are sold to the military and political and business elite of China who want tiger skins as rugs, as home decor, or tiger bones for medicine, or tiger bone wine. So it is quite a complex network of a criminal network. We see India and Nepal working very well together to try and dismantle that network, but we need to see more investment from China in the kind of covert surveillance, sophisticated investigation at the consumer end to help India and Nepal crack these criminal networks.
How difficult is it, just on a personal level, how difficult is it to get close to these operatives?
I personally am not a plausible buyer of tiger skin, bone, teeth or claws in China. EIA has staff who can pass themselves off as plausible buyers. These are not products that are necessarily openly for sale. You can't just walk into a shop and see them. It requires a little bit more of a clever engagement with the traders to find out what they have available. There's always little clues. These guys want to sell what they have. So there's always little clues, and you can profile a typical shop or a market where maybe they're offering ivory openly for sale, or some other wildlife parts and products for sale, and just by simply engaging them in conversation about business, you then get an invitation to either come back after hours or go to other premises where they will show you tiger and leopard skins. So it's not a straightforward case of, in terms of the enforcement operations, it's not straightforward. They can't just walk in, see products openly for sale and confiscate them. There needs to be a level of investment from China in intelligence-led enforcement and more surveillance and infiltration of these networks to flush out, who are the key people behind them.
Ofir, I know that your work is in Africa and you've spent many years clamping down and prosecuting traffickers. How have you gone about doing that?
Well, we cooperate with governments. The Eagle Network is basically fighting corruption to get the wildlife law applied. So we are helping in hunting down those major traffickers, not the small poachers, but the big fish, and basically working through undercover investigations, coordination of arrest operations, legal follow-up, tight legal follow-up, and through the entire process, fighting corruption. And I would say that a little bit different from what Ted was saying earlier, we have a picture of more than 1,300 major traffickers that we assisted to put behind bars. The picture that we have is from daily interaction with those traffickers when they are interrogated just before getting to jail. So I would say we have a very precise kind of look and a daily look at what it is about. And much of it, especially the ivory trade, the illegal trade in apes, illegal trade in parrots, is very much a mafia-like organization. We see it linked to other forms of crime, like the drug trade, arms trade, and other forms of crime, money laundering definitely. And we also see it rooted in corruption. So all this would not be possible for organized crime to actually operate without corruption. And that's where we are putting our emphasis.
Okay, Ted, what do you respond to that it all stems from, a lot of it stems from corruption, that it is incredibly entrenched and mixed in with all the other types of illicit trade that goes on?
Absolutely. I think Ofir is dead on in assessing that corruption is the primary point of vulnerability here. As with any commodity that can be traded legally with the right paperwork, buying paperwork or acquiring paperwork through corruption is a huge point of vulnerability. So solving the international wildlife crime problem is definitely at its core about rooting out corruption.
Debbie, you mentioned in your first answer that the elites, the business elites, the political elites are buying all of these illegal products. I mean, that in itself is quite shocking to hear. But also, how many of them are complicit in getting the stuff to the markets to be sold? How many of them are turning a blind eye to the trade?
I'm not sure it's turning a blind eye to the trade, but in terms of combating the international illegal trade and the transnational criminal networks, there definitely needs to be a lot more investment from the authorities in China to investigate it and flush out that corruption. We know it's happening because we've seen court cases in China where it's skins of tiger, leopard, snow leopard, or bones that have been gifted as bribes. So we know it's happening, but there needs to be a more systematic approach to investigating that trade and flushing it out. But there is an area of conflict of interest in China, and that is because the government laws and policies actually stimulate demand and trade for tiger parts and products, because the laws and policies prop up tiger farms. There are over 5,000 tigers in captivity in China. There is a licensed trade in the skins of the tigers that die in captivity, which can be turned into rugs for home decor. And so you have this conflict of interest where, on one hand, the government says, oh, we're committed to ending tiger trade, but on the other hand, they're actually creating a mechanism by which illegally acquired tiger skins can be laundered through a legal system. We've met taxidermists, licensed taxidermists, who are explaining how they abuse the system to launder illegally acquired tigers. So it's not so much a blind eye. It's out. It's right there in black and white on paper in the policies in China. And we think there's a lot more that the government can do. They're right now reviewing their wildlife protection laws. China wants to move forward with an ecological civilization. So it's actually quite a key time at the highest levels of government. If they want to end tiger trade, they can change the laws, close down tiger farms, and say, no more. Complement the efforts towards zero poaching from India and Nepal, complement those efforts by driving through a policy of zero demand and closing these farms down, saying no tiger trade from any parts and products of tiger from any sources, wild or captive. Sure. And that would be a great help.
And that would send a strong message. Ofir, from your work there in many different African countries, to what extent are you finding public servants, government officials complicit, fueling the trade themselves?
Well, definitely that is the main problem. I would say that from 1,300 arrests that we have carried with the authorities, 85% of them, we can tell you who was trying to bribe who in the field. So that's 85% corruption rate in the field. Of course, we are there to try to assist the government in fighting it heads on, which results in many arrests of police officers, army captains and high officials, and getting them to jail. In the courts, the rate of corruption is not that much better. So in 80% of all of these statistics, we can tell you in court who was trying to solicit which bribe and how much. Once again, we are there to assist government in fighting it. So the actual process itself of the police force and the justice system is susceptible to corruption, once again, for those that are the big guys behind the trade. Besides this, we have people who are official and they are in position of power. So they use this position of power in order to climb up in the illegal trade and have a position in the illegal trade as well. So I would say throughout the years, we've gotten governors behind bars, army personnel behind bars, police officers behind bars, politicians, very wealthy people, ex-ministers, etc. Very rich repertoire of high officials that we managed to get behind bars. And these are the countries who are actually trying to do something about it.
Right.
So imagine what happens in countries which cannot even stand for a single wildlife trafficker behind bars up to now, which is majority of countries around the world.
Any specific cases there, Ofir? Any naming and shaming that you feel it's worth doing?
Well, one example of it is when we started looking at the mafia behind the illegal trade in African gray parrots. This is the gray parrots most people know as the talking parrots, the gray ones. What people are not aware of is that actually the illegal trade in this parrot is very much threatening the flocks of this parrot in the rainforests of Central Africa. Basically, this trade was getting millions of dollars weekly to whoever was in the head of this illegal pyramid of illegal export of this of thousands of these parrots every month. And we realized that in the end, the person in the top of that pyramid was no other than the Secretary General of the Ministry in charge of wildlife in that country. It's like a deputy Minister of Environment. And this example, and he was removed, of course, right after. This example is not an isolated example. We have many examples of high officials that are behind illegal trade. Another example is in Guinea. The person who was in charge of the authority of applying the UN Convention on Trade of Wildlife, the CITES Convention, a person who was basically the authority of any export of wildlife in the country. And he is right now behind bars after we have managed to arrest him facilitating illegal trade in African great apes in the hundreds.
Okay.
So all this is not isolated examples. It's only that some countries were able to tackle this rife corruption. Some countries do not have a start, and we want to try to get them to start getting serious in fighting wildlife crime and fighting corruption.
Ted, when you're listening to Ofir, just naming and shaming there some of the officials who are supposed to be protecting the wildlife being most complicit in the trade, what is to be done about that? And I know in your report you do say that when public servants are implicated in facilitating traffic, the UN Convention on Corruption should be utilised. But how would that work?
Well, absolutely. There are many tools for dealing with wildlife trafficking, and the corruption in source countries or transit countries or destination countries doesn't end the story. We know that very little wildlife trade occurs within countries. It's usually transnational. And when that happens, we have a point of insertion for international action and cooperation. So wildlife crime is very complex. Each one of the commodities that's being moved internationally is distinct, and each one needs to be assessed for its vulnerabilities. And then based on where the corruption lies, the nature of the market, we can then decide where is the point of vulnerability where pressure should be placed to break the trafficking chain. But just because there's corruption in source countries, there's still action that we can take, aside from eliminating all corruption at source or even in destination markets.
OK, well, as we mentioned earlier, I mean, the United Nations does say that almost every country in the world does play a role in the illegal wildlife trade. But there does seem to be a trend in where that wildlife is ending up. And this map here shows the total number of seizures around the world. It gives us a pretty good idea of destination countries. Most of the seizures were in the US, Australia and in Western Europe, as well, of course, as in India and, most importantly, as we've already heard, China. Ted, when we talk about demand, we often talk about China as being sort of the big baddie, the main destination, but it might come as a surprise to know that the UK, the US and Australia are key ports of destination. I mean, what exactly is ending up there?
All right, now let me just clarify something about the nature of the seizure data. The fact that a country makes a wildlife seizure doesn't mean it's more complicit than a country that doesn't make a wildlife seizure. It just means that they bothered to take the proactive effort necessary in order to make the seizure.
Yeah.
So it's not surprising that some of the countries with the greatest interdiction capacity have the highest seizure rates. And countries that have very little interdiction capacity are not seizing a lot. It's also true that most countries inspect their imports more carefully than they inspect their exports. So countries that are source countries are less likely to intercept that wildlife going out of the country than the countries that are on the receiving end of that wildlife. So you can't just look at a seizure map and determine where the problem lies. Fortunately, each one of those seizure incidents doesn't just talk about the country that made the seizure. It talks about the entire trafficking chain, because most of this wildlife is seized in containers or in air freight or even on commercial air flights. And each time that happens, we can record where the seizure came from and where it was going, where the commodity came from and where it was going. If it's seized in a transit country or if it's the destination country, it's the same. So by making these sorts of assessments, we can get a better sense of where things are going. And it's on the basis of that that we make the statement that every country is involved to a lesser or greater degree. Not just because certain countries make a lot of seizures, but because other countries implicate certain countries in certain trafficking chains.
Another point that the report makes is that the illegal products are making their way onto legal markets. How much of a problem is that? How do you combat that?
Indeed, this also it depends entirely on the trafficking chain. Some products like rhino horn or pangolins or elephant ivory, it seems that most of it's being destined for illicit markets. So there are illicit markets for some of these products in certain parts of the world, but that's not where they're not large enough to launder a lot of the products that are coming out. But some of them, indeed, the primary destination market, the people who are buying them are unaware that what they're buying is illicit. And those markets, the ways that to prevent that are also very varied. Something that certainly could help a lot is that if the industries that are involved in making use of wildlife products were to engage in better supply chain management through track and trace mechanisms of the sort, for example, that are used to monitor fish offtake, fish sales in places like Germany, similar sorts of barcoding and tracking of where a wildlife commodity was sourced, who sourced it, when, how it was transported, and how it wound up in its destination market. More information of this sort as an industry standard could be extremely useful.
Okay, Debbie, the report said that the wildlife crimes have been increasing dramatically over the last few years, despite all these efforts to combat it. Is that something that is reflected in your work in the field?
Yes, and I think we're all much more aware of organised transnational wildlife crime these days. I think there have been some crises. There is a crisis in Africa with regards to elephants and rhinos. But in actual fact, in terms of how organised wildlife has become, it was 15 years ago when the CITES Secretariat and organisations like Environmental Investigation Agency and the Wildlife Protection Society of India started documenting how organised and systematic the poaching of tigers and other Asian big cats was between India, Nepal and China. And in fact, if you look back in history, to the 80s and the huge rhino horn syndicates that were running out of Taiwan, or the ivory syndicates that were running out of Hong Kong, drawing in ivory from Africa through the Middle East, wildlife crime has always had elements of serious transnational organised crime. It's just that we never dealt with it adequately at the time. It's not simple enough just to bring in bans and good legislation, but to enforce that legislation. And what we really need to see is more interagency cooperation at the national level. So we can't expect forest and national park officers who don't have any police training to be able to operate like police and to gather intelligence on criminals operating at the national level. So we need to see more professionalisation of the agencies that are responsible for the prevention of poaching and trafficking, but also not just interagency cooperation, much better international cooperation. So we are seeing, for example, in India right now, a lot more cooperation between India and Nepal to deal with a recent surge in tiger poaching. 30 tigers killed this year so far. That's more than all of the tigers killed in India last year. So, but we need China to cooperate to close that circle.
Yeah, that's the big loud message, isn't it, from that part of the world? Ofir, just in the last minute that we have left, what do you think will make enforcement more effective?
Well, I definitely agree, first of all, that organized crime has been there for several decades. Most of the kingpins that we get behind bars have been engaged in the exact same activities in the same level of organization for 3 decades, in charge, each one of them, of dozens of thousands of elephants killed and so on. I think that you talked about increased efforts. I disagree. I think we have increased talks. Efforts are something different. It's a pretty straightforward business enforcement. Either you hunt down those traffickers and put them behind bars, or either you don't. And I think a lot of the talks is actually getting us away from the real subject.
Okay.
I would say we need to aim at the number of major traffickers we put behind bars. We need to fight corruption, and we need to start seeing results rather than talking.
Okay, more action, less talking. Thank you very much, all of you, for joining us here for this discussion. Hopefully it will lead to more action. Ted Leggett, Debbie Banks and Ofir Drori. And thank you too very much for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, that's aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page, that's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Laura Kyle, and the whole team here, bye for now.